Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 8 on liberation of mind and Nibbana in the context of the lecture series True Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. My name is Dr. Florian Lau, and today we will continue where we left off last time. Last time we were discussing the Buddha's awakening, had a short story time about the death of the two chief disciples of the Buddha. Then we discussed and had a short recap on all the different stages that lead up to the full liberation of mind, namely the Patujana stage, then the stage of the right view, then the stage of the, before that, the stage of the faith and Dhamma follower, and then the other stages of the Sakadagami and the Anagami, namely the once returner, 7 times at most returner, and the once returner. Then we discussed how to overcome one of the taints in detail, namely the taint of sensuality. And today we will continue with overshooting the mark. Namely, beginners do a lot of different mistakes when they just start out on their practice. And when it comes to the understanding of sensuality, one of those overshootings can easily happen. Because once people notice that certain things tend to be bad, that they thought of as good, then they immediately jump to the polar opposite extreme, which is a very common behavior in humans. Once they realize that something is bad, they make it the worst, and they disregard the middle ground where things could be good, could be bad. And we will see where this will end. But before we go into that, as always, we do 5 minutes of non-reactivity meditation that are completely optional. If you wish, you can join in and weaken your craving a little bit, so it becomes easier to understand the teachings of the Buddha, because they are impossible to understand through your craving, which is incredibly important to keep in mind. Okay, so when you sit down, just make sure that you do not act out of any unwholesome impulses, like wanting something better, wanting something bad to go away, or wanting to distract yourself from a neutral feeling, wanting to feel anything at all right now. Those three things should be avoided. Those are the root of pretty much everything unwholesome, and if you do not act out of any of those things, then you automatically weaken craving and make your mind more ready to understand Dhamma. And I will now shortly pause so that you can actually do the meditation, and afterwards I expect that you are done and continue. Okay, I assume that you are done now, and we will continue with the content of this lecture, namely with overshooting the mark. And here are a few beginner mistakes that people who are rather new to meditation or just had some insight when it comes to meditation usually make. And when it comes to sensuality, beginners usually misunderstand that topic greatly. In the beginning, they usually think that everything is a desire, which is a frequent comment that I get on YouTube, where people try to argue against Buddhism and say that it is impossible to overcome desire, as that very desire to overcome desire is also a desire. Well, while that is technically true, you can just abandon your desires one after another. The Buddha always called it a gradual training. You don't have to begin with the desire to overcome desire. In that case, yeah, it is impossible if you overcome that desire first. But if you overcome it last, then there's no problem. Or later on the path, where everything is pretty much running on its own already. And the thing is, even if everything is a desire, the problem is not in the good and bad things in the world, as the Buddha put it. You do not have to avoid everything, because there is a very important difference between something agreeable and something agreeable that you crave towards. For the unenlightened person, those two things are completely identical. A person who has not attained the right view yet does not really know the difference between those two. So it's very difficult for them to understand that you can actually do things without craving being there. Those things will just happen or seemingly happen on their own, which is perfectly fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. After all, the human body has to eat. It has to move. We have to work to have some kind of income, unless we are a monk. And even if you are a monk, you could call that very much some kind of work, because you are teaching people, and that is pretty much the work of a teacher, to be perfectly honest. So in essence, they are trying to earn some kind of living too. That is necessary as humans. As long as we have a body, all those actions are absolutely necessary for our survival. There is a certain set of actions that we must perform, and there is not necessarily greed involved when we go after those actions. And what you should avoid, and I said that quite often by now, are all the choices rooted in greed, aversion, and delusion, because those are all the choices that require a sense of self, or a sense of self will emerge from those choices. After all, as I said in the last lecture, sensuality maintains ignorance, and the fact that we have a self, or live like we have a self, is due to our ignorance of non-self, of the factors of our experience that clearly tell us that there cannot be any self. But as we do not look at those factors, and we do not look at the 3 marks, we live like we have a self. And this is a problem. This is one of the very big problems. So if you avoid all the choices that are rooted in those 3 things, then you are good to go. Everything else is perfectly fine. And again, we had that in chapter 5 in very much depth. There are certain things that can be, for example, unwholesome in the morning if you crave certain types of coffee or food or whatever, but they are no longer unwholesome in the evening because you don't crave it then. It can change by the minute. And you always have to look out for your own craving and for your own intentions. And the goal is pretty much not to react to feelings. You do not want to automatically give in to the pressure that feelings exert on you. Everything else is pretty much fine. But that requires a certain degree of understanding what feelings or craving are. So when you do not know what that is and cannot really, let's say, pinpoint that in your experience, then you will have a very hard time to not act out of it, because you don't know what to look for. And it's pretty much impossible to do this kind of gradual training accidentally, because it requires a lot of, let's say, targeted action of certain things that you must do for a very long time until they come to fruition and you attain your right view or your stream entry. And in essence, you always pretty much try to resist craving. And when there is no craving, because there is a neutral feeling, then the ground is prepared for contemplating impermanence. Because the Buddha said that it is best to contemplate impermanence when there is a neutral feeling. And the reason for that is very simple, because you cannot really misunderstand whatever is happening through your craving when there is no craving right now, except for maybe for the craving to get rid of the neutral feeling. Maybe let's put it like that. But yeah, so this is pretty much what you must do. You do not have to overshoot in one direction or the other. Not all pleasures are bad because you notice that craving is bad. But this is something that many beginners do. They jump to that conclusion. And the Buddha did that too on the level of the Bodhisattva before he attained his liberation of mind. He did notice in the beginning that sensual pleasures have a certain drawback and that they might not be the best thing to do. And then, as that was a zeitgeist at his time, he jumped to the polar opposite and practiced extreme asceticism. And as a result, he got nowhere. And at some point he realized, okay, there are certain kinds of pleasures that are fine, but those pleasures are apart from sensuality. So when he said that the pleasures of jhanas are fine, that does not mean that there is a real pleasure involved. This is a pleasure that results from non-craving. As long as you crave your jhana, you cannot experience the joy of jhana, let's put it like that. Because the joy of jhana, the pleasure of jhana, is a type of relief that you can only experience when you are withdrawn from sensuality. And sensuality does include pretty much all kinds of pleasures that you want to get. This is a distinguishing mark. As long as you want to get something, that is the problem. It is not that there is no craving while you are getting your pleasure. That is perfectly normal because you got what you were craving for. The craving always happens before you get your pleasure. This is very important to keep in mind. So when you crave for your jhana before your jhana, then that will hinder your entering the real Buddha jhanas, which are the supreme kind of happiness and the supreme kind of relief that the Buddha was talking about. Okay, but let us now continue with a very good simile that the Buddha used to explain the different kinds of mistakes that people make on their path to full liberation of mind. And this is from Majjhima Nikaya number 25, I believe. I tend to mix up the numbers, but in the end you can look it up for yourself and scan the QR code that I posted there. Essentially what the Buddha did is compare certain groups of people with certain deer herds. And the Buddha set up the following scenario. Monks, a deer trapper does not lay down bait for a deer herd, intending thus, may the deer herd enjoy the bait that I have laid down, and so be long-lived and handsome and endure for a long time. No. A deer trapper lays down bait for a deer herd, intending thus, a deer herd will eat food unwarily. By going right amongst the bait that I have laid down, so by doing so they will become intoxicated. And when they are intoxicated, they will fall into negligence. When they are negligent, I can do with them as I like on account of this bait. And this is very important, because this time around the Buddha compares the deer trapper to Mara the Evil One. And Mara the Evil One is pretty much, well, you could interpret him as a metaphor, but the Buddha was talking very real about Mara. A person or a deity or some kind of other entity, however you want to phrase it, who is pretty much responsible for putting sensual objects in the world that we crave. So he puts out a bait, a sensual bait in the sense of humans, that we pick up, and in doing so, we become vulnerable to old age, intoxication, and all the other things that cause us suffering or death, pretty much. So he compares the deers with the humans, or us practitioners, and the deer trapper with Mara, the Evil One, who tries to trap those deers. And he will try to trap those deers in various different ways, as we will see. And it's a very fitting metaphor, because in the end, the bait of sensuality, as I have displayed in chapter 5, I think, is not so different from the bait that a deer falls for. The only thing is that it is slightly more elaborate, and it is slightly less visible, at least for us. For example, a mouse trap is pretty much invisible for a mouse, because there is something of value in there to them. And as soon as there is something of value in the dangerous sensuality, as the Buddha put it, then we will go for it, because there is a reward at the end. And this kind of behavior leads to our misery for a long time, as the Buddha put it, because we take something up that is very poisonous and very bad for us, and we act like it was good. And in the last lecture, we discussed what the real problem with that is, namely that sensuality is inherently painful, and it makes us susceptible to all kinds of suffering in the future. All kinds of future lives are included in that too. So it's a great mass of suffering that we are taking on us. So there's a great danger and very little gratification. That little gratification that is in sensuality is just the stopping of the pain for a time, but you make it stronger in the process. And this is not something that you should. That's not a good trait. Let's put it like that. And now the Buddha explains the behavior of the first deer herd. And this deer herd is pretty much the deer herd that is akin to the worldly people who just blindly go after their sensual pleasures, who have not noticed any drawback yet. Now the deer herd of the first kind ate food unwarily, by going right amongst the bait that the deer trapper had laid down. By doing so, they became intoxicated. When they were intoxicated, they fell into negligence. And when they were negligent, the deer trapper did with them as he liked on account of that. This is how the deers of the first herd failed to get free from the deer trapper's power and control. So if you transfer that simile to spiritual practitioners, then you will understand how the first herd of deers does not get free from samsara, does not get free from the grip of Mara, the Evil One, because they are still attached to their kind of pleasure. And it does not really matter what kind of pleasure they are attached to. It matters that the process of attachment is a rather general one. You will maintain your craving no matter what you crave. So it does not have to be the sensual, the extremely sensual kind of craving in the world out there, like drugs or alcohol, tasty foods, the opposite sex, or anything like that. It can also be the craving for the jhanas. This is why the Visuddhimagga book, even though I do not think it did many good things, it rightly pointed out that the practices that they displayed there can lead to certain problems, namely to the corruptions of insight. By practicing a jhana that is not free from sensuality, that you crave before it happens. In that way, you fall for the trap of Mara and do not get yourself free from craving, simply because you constantly reinforce that craving. And whenever you give in to craving, it grows stronger in the process. And thus, you cannot break free of the control of Mara, the Evil One, or if you were a deer, you would not break free from the control or the power of the deer trapper. And then we have the deers of the second herd that avoids all kinds of pleasures. And the Buddha continued as follows. Suppose, from the point of view of the deer herd, we altogether shun that bait food, shunning that fearful enjoyment. Let us go into the forest wild and live there. And they did so. But in the last months of the hot season, when the grass and the water were used up, their bodies were reduced to extreme emaciation. With that, they lost their strength and energy. When they had lost their strength and energy, they returned to the same bait that the deer trapper had laid down. They ate food unwarily by going right amongst it. And that is how the deer trappers of the second herd also failed to get free from the deer trappers' power and control. So those deers did more things right than before. They realized that there was danger in the bait, that there was danger in the pleasant things in the world, but they misdiagnosed the problem. They sought for the solution to their problems in the object in the world, and that is not where it is. It is in our craving towards the objects that are pleasant in the world, or painful in the world, or neutral in the world. Doesn't really matter. So they, well, went for the extreme avoidance route. The thing is, we cannot starve our senses, as an example. Our senses will want agreeable things in the world, and they will never be depleted. We cannot deplete the food of the senses. Sooner or later, we will encounter some pleasant form, or anything like that, some pleasant sound, some pleasant sight, some pleasant touch, or whatever. What is important is that we do not crave for those things, but as those deers have misdiagnosed the problem, they completely tried to avoid all the sensual things and went somewhere where they were not so much exposed to their kinds of pleasures. But when their food runs out, and there is nothing that they can do pretty much but to return to the old place and eat the food of the bait and return to the old habitual patterns. Or in modern words, they start binging like crazy because they have not tackled the problem at its root. Simply by avoiding your material of addiction, you will not overcome that addiction, at least not in the most general sense. You have to uproot the addiction where it matters, namely at the level of craving or at the level of ignorance, to put it into the Buddhist terminology. And thus, those deers have also not escaped the grip of Mara the Evil One. And then we have a third kind of deer herd, and this herd is even more advanced than the one before. But still, as we will see in the end, they are not yet free of the grip from Mara the Evil One or from the deer trapper. And the Buddha continues as follows. Suppose, again from the point of view of the deer herd, we make our dwelling place within the range of the deer trapper's bait. Then, having done so, we shall eat food not unwarily, and without going right amongst the bait that the deer trapper has laid down. By doing so, we shall not become intoxicated. When we are not intoxicated, we shall not fall into negligence. When we are not negligent, the deer trapper shall not do with us as he likes on account of that bait. And they did so. But the deer trappers and his followers considered thus: these deers of the third herd are cunning and crafty as wizards. Suppose we have the bait that is laid down completely surrounded, all around over a wide area, with wicker hurdles. Then perhaps we might see the third deer herd's dwelling place when they go hide. Okay. Well, and on account of that, very severe trapping on account of that very crafty trap that the deer trappers came up with, those deers too fell into the trap of the deer trappers, because they held wrong views still. So they were holding views like the world is infinite, the world is eternal, the self is eternal, the self goes here and there, where is the Tathagata be after death, etc. So they grew attached to a certain kind of views. They kinda grew attached to their method, and in doing so, they still fell for the trap that the deer trapper set up for them. Or to put it into monk words or practitioner words, they fell for their own views. They grew attached to their own views about the world, about the practice, etc. And that too is a kind of very subtle attachment. It is an attachment to views that is one of the taints that the Buddha described as having to be overcome for attaining final liberation of mind. So those that deer herd failed to get rid of that taint of views. And as a result, they still were within the domain of Mara the Evil One, and the deer trappers could do with that deer herd as they wanted. They were much more advanced than the other deer herds before, but still, the Mara the tempter, or the trap of sensuality, can be very crafty, and it will always re-establish wherever it can find footing. It is very important to keep that in mind, and thus it is very important not to think that you are done too fast. Otherwise, you will grow complacent, and as a result, you will very likely make no additional effort towards final liberation of mind, even though there might still be work to be done. And then we have the fourth deer herd that was liberated in the end. And that deer herd contemplated as follows. Suppose we make our dwelling place where the deer trapper and his followers cannot go. This is rather simple. Then having done so, we shall eat food not unwarily, and without going right in amongst the bait that the deer trapper has laid down. By doing so, we shall not become intoxicated. Then the deer hunter and his followers considered thus: if we scare the fourth deer herd, being scared, they will alert others, and so the deer herds will all desert this bait. that we have laid down. Suppose we treat the false deer herd with indifference. They did so. And that was how the deer of the false herd got free from the deer trapper's power and control. So those deers did exactly the right thing. They went where the deer trappers cannot go. And that is exactly what we try to do in meditation. We go where Mara, the evil one, cannot go. We go to a place inside, let's put it like that, where there is no control of Mara, the evil one. He cannot see us when we do not crave, to put it in very simple terms or in a bit mythical terms. So we do not go into a domain that is not ours. When we send our mind down into the domain of the senses, that domain is Mara's domain. And in that domain, he can do with us whatever he pleases. So he can throw you left and right and make you suffer and whatnot. And in the end, you will fall prey to death or deadly suffering. But in going smart about it, by avoiding the places where Mara can go and just taking the pleasures that are available to us in that domain where Mara cannot reach us, we can actually get free of the grip of Mara. And that is exactly what the deer herd did. They did everything perfectly right. And thus they were treated with indifference by Mara, the evil one. As in the simile of the hunters, Mara could still make an effort to get those deers back, or to get those monks that are liberated back. They are completely free, but Mara does not know that. And if he tried too hard, then he fears that he might scare other practitioners too, and stir them up, who are still on a level where it's easy to keep them in the sensual domain. So this is the meaning of the simile. And it's a rather good one, because there are very, very subtle intoxications of mind that can hinder you from reaching final liberation of mind. And one of the biggest one, and one of the most blameworthy one, is the holding of wrong views. It's as simple as that. If you, for example, and this is a wrong view, think that you are done but are not done, then you will make no additional effort. So that can entirely block your progress towards final liberation of mind. And this can happen very early on in the practice, by the way. Many people think themselves done when they have had the tiniest of attainment in meditation. And this is a problem, at least in this very life, if you want to attain liberation of mind in this very life. Okay, but let us now continue with the presentation. And now we come to the actual Nibbana that the Buddha talked so much about. And I want to really clear up some myths when it comes to the idea of Nibbana. Because nowadays there are all kinds of different views on what Nibbana is and what Nibbana is not. Many people try to interpret Nibbana as a complete cessation of consciousness. And those are the words that the Buddha used, by the way. He said that consciousness ceases. But he was obviously walking around all the time teaching people, and his body was clearly a conscious one. There was consciousness for the Buddha, and there is consciousness for all Arahants. They do not become some kind of vegetable that cannot move anymore or anything like that. Consciousness is clearly there. It has not ceased completely. What has ceased is the ownership from consciousness, and as a result, the suffering cannot manifest anymore, because the suffering can only manifest when there is a self. You can only suffer when there is a you that can suffer, to put it simple. So what ceases is always the self part from all sankharas, and this is true for pretty much every ceasing that the Buddha talked about, and not the aggregates itself. The aggregates remain standing in the world for an Arahant, but they are empty. Empty of what? They are empty of self, and as a result, they are empty of suffering. Okay, and the 5 higher fetters that the Arahant overcomes are lust for material existence, lust for immaterial existence, or this is often translated as the lust for jhana, then conceit, or the feeling of meanness, or I am, which is oftentimes in the aggregate of consciousness, or mana, and then restlessness, or being pressured over all, and ignorance of the 3 marks, which is the biggest one and the last one that falls. The Arahant has seen the 3 marks in everything. There is nothing exempt from them, and as a result, they can no longer suffer anymore. And all types of lust are abandoned by seeing the danger or repulsiveness in things. You see the 3 marks in whatever you look at, and as a result, the mind will grow dispassionate towards those things. The mind will only ever try to own things that are disagreeable. And once you notice, oh, those things are not permanent that I am attached to, as a result, you cannot control them as you thought you can. And as a result of that, you will experience the passion towards those things. And as a result, you are liberated. First enchanted, then dispassionate, and then liberated. So liberation always comes through dispassion. This is also something that people usually overlook when they read the suttas, because they are kind of cherry picking. They go to the suttas with an agenda. They want to confirm their beliefs while reading the suttas, instead of being more or less a blank page and trying to find out what liberation really is. And this can only fail. This is why so many people are bad scientists, by the way, because they do their science with an agenda. They try to confirm what they believe anyway, and as a result, they do bad research and miss the important points. This is why like 80% of all scientists are bad. And this is why so many studies have to be distrusted, because many people just manufacture studies and don't try to actually come up with the truth, but just confirm what either people paid them for or what their beliefs tell them anyway. But yeah, as we can see here in this short exercise that we already had in another chapter, I want to repeat it here because it's very important here and not everyone watches all the videos. So first do the first block, then pause the video, ponder a bit, and then we can have the solution. But yeah, just to give you an idea how this dispassion business works, how the perception of non-self comes to be through dispassion, we have a short exercise. Imagine playing a video game with your controller in your hand with an elder brother or a friend. You have a controller in your hand, they have a controller in your hand, and you are fully absorbed in the game. Maybe you're playing Mario Kart or something, and you lean left and right and feel completely frustrated when something goes not along your way. And you delight when everything works and you win, for example. But now imagine that you have to scratch yourself and notice that the game continues in the background. You are stretching yourself, doing no inputs at all, and the game continues. And you decide to investigate and notice that your controller is not even plugged in. How would you feel? And now ponder on that for a while. But yeah, I will continue now and assume that you are done. Well, you would very likely not be able to maintain the same level of enchantment and involvement in the game. And why would you? You would not suffer as much as before, you would not delight as much as before. None of those things would apply anymore, because the level of attachment can simply not be maintained. You will be disenchanted with the game, and as a result, you will grow dispassionate, because it's not you playing anymore. And your interest in the game will slowly fade over time, and the spell of the game will vanish, and through that kind of dispassion, Nibbana will come, as an example. So, through noticing the unownability, the uncontrollability of that game, simply because your controller was not plugged in all the time, and you just ignored that fact, there will be the perception of first dukkha, or stress, or suffering, or however you want to translate it, and then there will be the perception of non-self through the other two marks. They are essentially, well, three sides of the same thing, but again, we always see non-self through the other two marks, which is very important to keep in mind. So we will grow dispassionate simply because what we formerly enjoyed and formerly thought we control, we actually cannot control, and thus we cannot really enjoy it anymore. But that also gets rid of the burden to get more of it all the time. And as a result, we will experience the supreme contentment and peace that the Buddha was talking about, the peace of Nibbana. But now a slide on what Nibbana actually is. So the most common formulation would be the freedom from the taints, the freedom from greed, aversion, and delusion. Those three poisons are uprooted through dispassion by seeing the three marks repeatedly. You see them over and over again in all things until there can no longer arise any greed, aversion, or delusion of any kind. And it is not a mere absence, by the way. It's not a temporary thing. It cannot regrow. It is impossible for any craving to ever come back into being. This is the point why liberation is permanent. And this is why it is an understanding, because you notice it was impossible in the first place, as in the simile of the video game that I just gave you. You could not control the game. It was not plugged in. So as a result, you no longer try to control it. And as a result, you can become liberated. And that tanha, and tanha is just an umbrella term for greed, aversion, and delusion. It's craving, just in Pali. The three poisons are uprooted, craving is uprooted, it is completely destroyed. And as a result, the self in all dhammas vanishes. It ceases to be. So all sankharas, all dependent things no longer can contain any self. And when there is no longer any self, then you are completely free. Well, you are completely free. And this, by the way, includes the mind as the ultimate background of all particular things. And your chitta, your heart mind, the level of feeling, mood, is liberated. And thus you experience cessation. And you have to remove even the most subtle traces of conceit from consciousness itself, from the aggregate of consciousness, from the overarching awareness. There is always pretty much a self-binding. There is a for-me-ness. Experience happens for me because I have a certain point of view. That point of view is rather arbitrary, is of no concern to a person who is not into spirituality. And as a result, they take it up as theirs and they suffer when things do not go their way, which is pretty much what happens most of the time. Or sooner or later it will happen. No matter in what heaven you are reborn, at some point or another things will not go your way anymore because your good karma is used up, and as a result you will be reborn in hell, as an example, when there's no more good karma left. But yeah, this is pretty much what Nibbana is. It's nothing mythical, which is very important to keep in mind. And there are lots of synonyms for Nibbana, by the way, that you can encounter in the suttas. And in the Samyutta Nikaya, there is a list of all the synonyms that you can go through. And people, again, usually just pick those that they like the most from this list and ignore all the others. But when the Buddha was talking about it, it is always a state that is completely detached from feelings and all the other things. He called it the unconditioned, as an example. And this can be really misunderstood. People think that there can be nothing at all to be unconditioned. But again, all the teachings of the Buddha always refer to the sankhara, to the self part of all sankharas. So that part is no longer conditioned. The condition for the self vanishes, and as a result you are liberated from the round of rebirth. So those are all kinds of synonyms. The destruction of lust, hate, and delusion is another one. The uninclined, the taintless, because the taints are destroyed. The truth, the other shore. The subtle, the very difficult to see. The unaging, the stable. The undisintegrating, the unmanifest. The unproliferated. The peaceful, the deathless, the sublime. The deathless is one of the more popular ones, because the self, the bhava, the being, is no longer, well, coming into being. It's no longer born. And as a result, we are free from suffering. The peaceful, the auspicious, the secure, the destruction of craving, the wonderful, the amazing, the unailing state, the unafflicted, dispassion. Also, and a synonym for Nibbana, by the way, purity, freedom, non-attachment, the island, the shelter, the asylum, the refuge, the destination and the path leading to the destination. So those are all synonyms that the Buddha used for the state of the deathless, for the state of Nibbana, which is also very important to keep in mind. So whenever you read one of those things, you can be quite certain that it is a synonym for Nibbana or anything very related to Nibbana. So yeah, all those things pretty much describe the very same thing in different words for people with different inclinations. This is important because not all words will appeal to all people. And the Buddha was talking to a lot of different kinds of people with different backgrounds, and he wanted to teach the Dhamma to all of them so that they could attain liberation of mind. And just to give you an idea, you contemplate yourself, by the way, or what you think of as self all the time, and then at some point you will notice that certain ideas about self and control, mastery and ownership do not hold up. So you notice that yourself cannot be controlled. It is anicca. There is a delay between everything. You are always too late because the whole always arises first, and then you try to make it yours. But in doing so, you always come late. And your prior assumption must be false. And upon seeing that often enough, anatta will be the result. And you can no longer think of yourself as self, and you will instead think of it as non-self, which is also very important to keep in mind. The sense of self, the feeling of meanness, let's put it like that, does not really fade. There is a sense of self, but it is no longer yours. Again, it is the sankhara part, the sankhara self part, that fades from the experience. You remove just the self. All the other things remain standing. Well, craving is completely removed too, and everything upwards the chain is also removed. But the aggregates remain. The Arahant still feels, he has still consciousness, he can move around, he can do things, he can teach, he can build kutis, he can repair certain things, he can even exercise, he eats, he does all those things. The only thing that changes is that he has no longer any sense of self, and as a result, he can no longer suffer. This is how things are unconditioned, how your liberation of mind is unconditioned. When there is no way that there can ever be a self again, then there is no way that you can ever suffer again, regardless what happens with the aggregates, regardless what is the content of your experience. You are free because you experience everything, no matter what it is, in the five aggregates, detached. It is no longer yours. But yeah, this is very important to keep in mind, because people think all the time that Nibbana is something very, very different. When they think about unconditioned, the only thing they can make it work in their minds is to remove everything from their experience. But then there would still be the experience of nothingness, which is also something. So yeah. But anyway, let us continue. So when the Buddha talked about Nibbana, and I want to strengthen the point I was just making, he talked about it as the complete experience of Anatta. And he explains that as an example in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Sevens, number 18. Here, monks, some person dwells contemplating non-self in all phenomena, perceiving non-self, experiencing non-self, constantly, continuously, and uninterruptedly focusing on it with the mind, fathoming it with wisdom. With the destruction of the taints, he has realized for himself, with direct knowledge in this very life, the taintless liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom, and having entered upon it, he dwells in it. So all you must do is perceive non-self in all phenomena, and then you are liberated. It cannot be any otherwise, in any other way. This is what liberation of mind is, the complete removal of self. And it will be very likely the biggest moment of grace you will ever experience when the self is gone. In the Therigatha, in the books of the utterances of famous disciples of the Buddha, people were always or often saying that all that vanishes is suffering, is arisen suffering, when the self vanishes, by the way. Because that is the sole reason that we suffer. And we have to keep that in mind. And when you are liberated, I want to give you a short exercise too for the liberation of mind. Again, the first part first, the second part second. Imagine being pushed around by two taskmasters at all time. You are a slave and have to do what they say. They follow you everywhere, no matter where you go. They force you to do whatever they want. Would you like that situation? Would you like being a slave? Or even slave to two people? You can pause and think for that for a moment, but I think the answer is very clear. So yeah, the Buddha compared our regular mode of existence or being with bondage, with being fettered, with being in slavery. And most of our behaviors are driven by the sometimes excruciating pressure of feelings and cravings. And you can compare craving to two taskmasters standing behind you. One of them is wielding a whip and is constantly threatening you with dangerous things and what he will do to you if you will not obey. And the other one is offering you rewards and is sweet-talking you all the time with his outlooks and prospects for future pleasures. And all your life, you follow all of their commands and never question them. You even think that you are doing all those things. But upon enlightenment, upon liberation of mind, you are no longer a slave to tanha, and you are completely liberated. You notice where you must go to no longer be subjected to the influence of the two taskmasters. And as a result, you can do whatever you wish and are no longer forced by your craving to do certain things. And as a result, this is liberation. This is why the Buddha called it liberation, because you are free now. You are no longer shackled to the samsaric existence. You are no longer bound by craving. You are no longer forced to do what your feelings say you must do. Let's put it like that. And when a monk realized the Nibbana, it was almost always displayed like this in the sutta. And I will just read it to you. When he knows and sees thus, his mind is liberated from the taint of sensual desires, from the taint of being, from the taint of ignorance. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge. It is liberating. He understands birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more of this. So this is from Majjhima Nikaya 7, but you can find it all over the suttas. And this is called the lion's roar, that a person utters when he has gained final knowledge, when he has made it till the end of the, Noble Eightfold Path, and is no longer subject to any kind of suffering or any kind of rebirth in the realm of samsara. So there is no more of this. So what we read here is pretty much that person in question has liberated himself from all the taints. Based on the right view that has been attained before, he now got himself rid of all sensual desire, of all desire for being, and of all ignorance pretty much of the three marks in his existence. And as a result, upon, maybe having paused the practice for a while and then reflecting upon it, he notices, oh, it is done. And then he will tell everyone he wants to tell, or his teacher or whoever, that he is done and that the spiritual life has been lived. And this is usually how the monks in the suttas have, well, let others know that they are done with the practice and they are now asekas, people who are beyond training and no longer need to do anything. And practically speaking, Nibbana and Nirvana mean the very same thing from different languages. Nibbana is from the Pali language, from the dialect that the Buddha himself spoke, and Nirvana is from the Sanskrit language, the ancient Indian language pretty much. Usually the Buddhist texts are displayed in Pali, that's why I use Nibbana more than Nirvana. And the mind that is established in Nibbana, can no longer be contacted by or pressured by feelings. When we talk about phassa or contact, it is a contact with a self that is added later on. And when this contact ceases, the feeling has pretty much nowhere to go, and it cannot cause us suffering anymore, even in the presence of the aggregate of feeling. And this is true for all kinds of feelings, by the way, no matter if good, bad, or neutral. From the Buddhist point of view, all of them are bad. And all of them are painful and thus left behind. And Nibbana is often described as a mind where nothing sticks to, the mind without surface. And it is, in principle, the presence of the absence of craving. And practitioners who had the experience of full liberation of mind, where there is no trace of self anywhere, not even the slightest trace of conceit in consciousness, always describe it as the biggest moment of grace that is completely incomparable, and all kinds of pleasure jhanas that you could have experienced are nothing in comparison to that. There is nothing to do anymore. Any desire for transformation or liberation has ceased at that point, because there is nothing to do, nothing to attain at that point. Before that, there is a lot to do and a lot to attain. So all those traditions that say, samsara and Nibbana are the same, you have to do nothing, there is nothing to attain, are very wrong. They can block your progress towards final liberation of mind for an eternity even, simply because they teach a doctrine that is leading to non-doing, or that can lead to non-doing. And this is dangerous enough. It does not mean, for example, that nihilism will always lead to non-doing. Some practitioners can still do things when they are somewhat nihilistic in their mindset, but it can lead to nihilism, and it can lead to non-doing, and over an eternity of time it will probably lead to non-doing, and that is not something that should be taught that way, as an example. And in summary, only the Arahant has seen Sankhara Dukkha and Sankhara Anicca fully in all phenomena. Until then, you have to progressively still all activities, still all sankharas, remove all the self from all the sankharas where there is still some kind of conceit left. And the state where you are dwelling in partial liberation, let's put it like that, is samadhi, where less and less things seem to appear as yours, seem to be under your control, seem to be owned by you. And the more you dwell in that state, the more it becomes a default. This is simply how the mind works. The more you dwell in a liberated state of mind and notice how much better it is, the more the mind wants of it. And as a result, you become more and more liberated until there is absolutely no turning back anymore. And the Buddha compared the experience of an uneducated ordinary person, a worldling, a Patushana, and an Arahant as follows. He said, monks, an uneducated ordinary person feels pleasant, painful, and neutral feelings. An educated noble disciple, or an Arahant, also feels pleasant, painful, and neutral feelings. What then is the difference between the ordinary uneducated person and an educated noble disciple, an Arahant? And the monks then said, our teachings are rooted in the Buddha. Please tell us what the difference is. And the Buddha continues, when an uneducated ordinary person experiences painful physical feelings with physical origin, feelings are always only good, bad, or neutral, then they sorrow and wail and lament, beating their breasts and falling into confusion. They experience two kinds of feelings, a physical one and a mental one. It's like a person who is stuck with an arrow, only to be struck with a second arrow. And that person experiences the feeling of two arrows. And this is very important to keep in mind, because this is the experience of an unenlightened person. It is not so much the pain, for example, when we stub our toe, that we suffer from. What we suffer from, and this is the second arrow, the suffering arrow. The first is the pain arrow, the second one is the suffering arrow. What we really suffer from is all the worry in our mind, all the aversion in our mind, all those things. This is the true suffering. And it is much greater than the physical pain. The pain will stop, and the pain will not really even bother you after a very short time. But the suffering can linger in the mind for a very, very long time. And the Buddha continues, in the same way, when an uneducated ordinary person experiences painful physical feelings, they sorrow and they fall into confusion. They experience two feelings, physical and mental, and when they are touched by a painful normal feeling that is not originating in the body, they resist it. The underlying tendency for aversion towards painful feelings underlies that. When touched by painful feelings, they look forward to enjoying sensual pleasures to counteract that. Why is that? Because an uneducated ordinary person does not understand any escape from painful feelings apart from sensual pleasures. They don't truly understand feelings, origin, ending, and gratification, the drawback and the escape. If they feel a pleasant, painful, or neutral feeling, they always feel it attached. And this sutta is a gold mine when it comes to the experience of the Bhikkhu and the Arahant, or pretty much any noble person. And what he says here is that the unenlightened person has no other way of dealing with bad emotions or feelings apart from covering them up with sensuality. So whenever you feel something bad as an unenlightened person, you have to leap out to chocolate, to alcohol, to sexual intercourse, or all those things. Otherwise, you cannot deal with the pain that arises. And they know no other escape, as they have not understood feelings and how they come to be, how they are dependently arisen, etc. How yourself and your suffering and all those things depend on other things that they cannot control. And as a result, they try to change what they cannot change. And they feel all those things attached. And when you feel something attached, then you suffer from it. Because you make it yours, you own it. And in comparison, when an educated, noble disciple experiences painful physical or normal feelings, they don't sorrow or wail or lament, beating their breasts and falling into confusion. They experience one feeling, physical, not mental. The feeling is still there, the aggregate of feeling. It's like a person who is struck with one arrow, but was not struck with a second arrow. That person would experience feelings of one arrow. When they are touched by painful feelings, they don't resist it. There is no aversion to that painful feeling. And they don't look forward to enjoying sensual pleasures. Thus, they do not have even more craving for things to change. If they feel a pleasant, painful, or neutral feeling, they feel it detached. And this is the difference between an educated noble disciple and an uninstructed ordinary person. A worldling, a Bhikkhu, as the Buddha put it. And if you want to read it up, you can scan the QR code. It's from the Samyutta Nikaya number 36. The sixth simile, or the sixth sutta. And the important part here is that the Arahant, or the noble person, experiences feelings detached. Feelings are still there. And this is something that is mind-blowing for people who have a very different understanding of the suttas. You can be free, completely free from suffering, in the presence of bad feelings. And this is what people usually do not understand, because they misconceive all the suttas through their craving. They always try to put a self somewhere in there, and thus nothing makes sense. You have to remove the self from the experience, and then you can understand that. So when there are suttas, they are sometimes from the point of view of an ordinary person, and sometimes from the point of view of an Arahant, or at least a person who has attained the right view, and thus seen the way out of suffering. They know what it means when you experience something detached. Because when there is a perception of non-self, it is a detached mode of being, and whatever you feel has not the same severity as before. You cannot simply suffer from it anymore. The second arrow is pretty much just gone, and it can never come back. Sure, you can immediately be hit by something painful, even by something painful that is mental to some degree, but it will immediately vanish. It is just the initial impulse that is there, but all the other things that usually result from it are no longer part of the equation, and as a result, there is basically no suffering left. In the Arahant, there's absolutely no suffering left, but for the person of right view, for the Sotapanna, there still can be some suffering left, especially if they fall back to sensuality, which is perfectly possible, by the way. They can go back to sensual pleasures, and as a result, they will suffer. As the verses from the Dhammapada said, there is nothing better for a noble disciple than to say no to everything that is endearing. And when that person does that, they will automatically end up at Nibbana. Because when they don't do that, they will maintain their ignorance. If they do nothing unwholesome by distracting themselves with sensuality, then liberation of mind will automatically be the result. And as you can see, there are a lot of things that Arahants and practitioners share in their experience. It is not that consciousness vanishes. I can only repeat that over and over again. And there are even 9 things that an Arahant simply cannot do, simply because the supporting conditions for those things to happen are destroyed. They are no longer there. And as a result, it is impossible for an Arahant, first, to intentionally kill. People can still die due to involuntary actions of the Arahant, as an example. There can still be accidents. In the suttas, there were a few cases where a monk accidentally had let himself fall on a cushion, and there was a baby underneath, and the baby died through that action. But the blameworthy part, when it comes to the monk, was that he was uncareful. And then the Buddha made a rule that you first have to check, as I understand it, before you sit down, so that you don't accidentally kill anyone who is sleeping under the pillows. So you don't want to experience that. But he is blameworthy because he did not check, not because he wanted to kill. He could not kill. And an Arahant is also incapable of taking what is not given. He cannot engage in sexual intercourse. And again, we have to be careful here what you interpret as sexual intercourse. Because in the suttas, there were Arahant nuns, as an example, that were raped. But that is not what sexual intercourse is. The intentional part is the problem. That nun did not want to have sexual intercourse, yet it was forced upon her. And the Buddha said the nun was blameless, as she did not want that. It is not, you do not see any value in that anymore. You cannot misconceive it anymore. You cannot ignore the painful part of the wanting that constitutes sexual intercourse, pretty much. And the Arahant can also not tell an intentional lie, as that always, all those things require greed, hatred, or delusion to be there. Without those supporting conditions of greed, hatred, and delusion, you cannot tell a lie, at least not an intentional lie. You can still not know something, but you cannot intentionally try to deceive other people. And an Arahant also cannot consume hoarded things as before. He cannot stock up on food and then take joy out of having those things lying around. And he cannot have biases or views based on desire, based on hatred or aversion, and based on fear or based on delusion. Because all those things are gone. And with the supporting conditions, namely based on fear, based on hate, based on lust, based on delusion, you cannot have views that are based on that. And it's as simple as that. If you really remove the supporting conditions of something, then it cannot re-arise in the future. So this is why an Arahant simply cannot do certain things. And even the Sotapanna has things that he cannot do anymore. He cannot kill his parents, as an example. He cannot draw the blood of the Tathagata, of the Buddha, and he cannot kill an Arahant or anything like that. He can do nothing that would bring him directly to hell, because it requires immensely strong greed, immensely strong hatred. And the Sotapanna, one of right view, simply does not have that strong greed anymore. So that is forever cut off. They cannot go there anymore. So the lowest destinations they can go to is the realm of humans. And now we come to many different paths that people took towards Arahantship when they tried to get there, because not all people are the same. And again, I really like to convey that point in the form of a map. And we start at the bottom left with the Divine Messenger event, an event that is so great and gives you a reason to seek the way out of suffering. Then there is a lot of daily practice, and people slowly get more and deeper into Dhamma. They start keeping the precepts, they start studying Dhamma, they might even attain the mundane right view, which is also a great feat nowadays, because most people do not have that. It is far too difficult for most people to even have the necessary responsibility of self-honesty to progress further than that on the path. They might even practice virtue, and they try really hard to understand. They contemplate, they experience meditative joy, meditative ease. They get a taste of jhana maybe even, and have some insights of mind and body, cause and effect, or into the 3 marks. And then at some point they might even experience an insight into dependent origination, and based on that, right view that they have attained, stream entry, or the penetration of the Four Noble Truths. And then, based on that, the first possible path is the path of the jhanas. A person who practices like that might go through the first, the second, the third, or the 4th jhana. Then they become a once returner and non-returner, and are later of full liberation of mind. So they go through the first 4 jhanas and on account of dwelling in the 4th jhana of equanimity, pretty much, they gain full liberation of mind. Yet another path is the path of the 8 jhanas. This person also progresses through the first 4 jhanas, but then also through the basis of infinity of space, basis of infinity of consciousness, basis of nothingness, basis of neither perception nor non-perception, and then somewhere in the process they become once returners, non-returners, probably also experience nirodha, namely the cessation of perception and feeling, and then experience the full liberation of mind, which is Nibbana in this very life. And yet another practitioner might also cultivate the first 4 jhanas and then cultivate the 3 true knowledges, namely the knowledge of past lives, the knowledge of rebirth or of karma, of how beings fare in accordance with their actions, and then they experience the latest supreme knowledge, namely the knowledge of the destruction of the taints, which is Nibbana, or full liberation of mind again. And then yet another person might go a slightly different way. They also, well, the path until dependent origination or stream entry is pretty much always the same. But then people can practice slightly different. For example, it is not necessary, strictly speaking, necessary to practice the jhanas. They can also use the Brahma Viharas or the divine abodes as their vehicle, and then can make it through all the other steps, once returner, non-returner, and then full liberation of mind. Because from that point onwards, it is about not fueling sensuality anymore. And doing that can have multiple ways. You don't always have to go the same way about it. Let's put it like that. As long as your behavior ensures that you are not acting out of great aversion and delusion, and thus maintaining ignorance, then you will make progress on the path. And the Brahma Viharas with the right view are a very good vehicle too. And then we have a last one here, and this is a path that the Buddha described as a path of a sharpshooter. A person who does not do any of the other things, simply does not act out of great aversion and delusion, and as a result of that, not even cultivate the jhanas. Well, there will be some jhana, because the full liberation of mind is essentially a state of jhana, but until then, until the full liberation of mind, they are not cultivating the jhanas or the Brahma Viharas or any of the other things beforehand. And he called those people sharpshooters because they directly go to the final goal of full liberation of mind. They leave out all the other steps, stream entry, once returner, non-returner, and then full liberation of mind. So it is possible to go that way. You don't have to cultivate the jhanas beforehand. You don't have to cultivate the Brahma Viharas. You don't have to do any of the things. You don't have to cultivate supernatural powers. If you are inclined that way, you can just go to the full liberation of mind without any of the prior steps. Let's put it like that. So as you can see, there are various different ways. And if you are practicing diligently and really make it your #1 goal, then the Buddha said that at least within 7 years, you will make it there. You will either have the result of full liberation of mind or be an anagami. If you really put your mind towards it and really be self-honest, be responsible, and practice according to what the Buddha said in the suttas, and relinquish your wrong views, basically. And on account of that, you will experience all the things that the Buddha explained, if you wish to. Not everyone, as I understand it, will experience the supernatural powers. They will only experience it if they are interested in that. And as an example, I have literally zero interest in any supernatural powers. That does not mean that they do not exist, but it just means that I will very likely not cultivate them. Simply because I don't want to. This is so a reason for it. But anyway, let us continue. And this is also a very important remark. Few things are worse than thinking that you are done too early. This is incredibly important. You should always continue practicing, as there is no harm in it. If you have a craving, however, against practicing, then there is a lot of harm in it. And then you should practice even more, because you should notice, oh, there is a craving. I don't want to practice. But when I don't want to practice, I'm not done with practicing. Because when there is craving, there is also suffering. And as a result, they are suffering right now, and thus should practice more. And even most monks in the suttas still meditated, even though they were done. They continued just in case. So did the Buddha. He meditated a lot, even after his liberation of mind, even though he technically did not have to. You simply practice non-attachment, maintain your higher virtue, and thus make sure that there is nothing missing. Again, there is no harm in it for a person who is enlightened, who is already liberated from all suffering. They would not suffer on account of the practice because it is uncomfortable or something. So they can just continue, and there's literally nothing wrong with that. In fact, if they have missed some tiny conceit somewhere, then it's good that they continue practicing. And this is very important to keep in mind. So if you think that you are done too early, it's very likely that your progress comes to a halt. And this happens to a lot of people. And the Buddha explains that with the simile of the hardwood of the Dhamma. People looking for hardwood go to some tree and just take the bark and be done with it. Just take the virtue part or something. Just are content with the right view or something. Still, they should make an additional effort to really get the hardwood of the Dhamma and have the full liberation of mind. Okay, but let us now come to the summary of this chapter, to the key points of chapter 8 of the Liberation of Mind chapter. First of all, there is still work to do beyond the right view, beyond stream entry, even though 99% of the suffering is already gone, or even more. Basically, all suffering is gone upon the point of stream entry. But a stream enterer has still to overcome sensuality fully and all the other taints by cultivating the perception of danger in it. You want to see the 3 marks in all things, pretty much continuously. And the point when you can no longer unsee the 3 marks at any given time, then you are pretty much liberated in mind. And you really have to integrate everything into the context of the already present things. Things that come into being, cease out of being, or change on their own. This is the important part. Things do that stuff on their own, without any necessity of any self. And Nibbana is nothing mythical. It is just the presence of the absence of greed, aversion, and delusion, or the destruction of the taints, the perfected perception of non-self, or the experience of cessation of self, the full cessation of self from all sankharas. This is what Nibbana is. It is not that you are mystically poofing out of experience or anything like that. From the outside, you cannot even know that a person is an Arahant. It is impossible. From the outside, pretty much everything stays the same. From the inside, everything is different. The person who is an Arahant experiences everything different. Even a person who has attained right view will experience everything differently. But again, from the outside, you cannot tell. You cannot tell if anyone is an Arahant. You can guess or ask and interrogate a person and find out if he had the experiences that are necessary for an Arahant to have. But apart from that, you can't do anything. The Buddha could, because he is a very special person who has powers that are far greater than the powers of any other person. But any regular being cannot tell. And in the end, the Buddha did teach many different ways to reach the final goal, depending on the inclination and the character. You don't always have to go about it in the same way. There are 4 foundations of mindfulness, and each of those foundations can be prioritized by you as an example, and can be used as a vehicle to train the amount of mindfulness necessary for attaining the final knowledge. You don't have to have perfect mindfulness, it just has to be sufficient. And any of the 4 bases will also cultivate the other 3 bases. So you can emphasize that in your practice, and should even probably take the one that is most in line with your personal character. And yeah, when you just maintain your higher virtue in not acting out of greed, aversion, and delusion, the result has to be that ignorance will fade away. Because ignorance, again, is also a sankhara, a dependent thing, and thus it requires maintenance. It requires constant reaffirmation, constant engagement in sensuality. When that engagement in sensuality fades, the result will be inevitably, sooner or later, the full liberation of mind. Depending on the effort you put into it, it will happen sooner or later. But again, that depends a lot on the personal character of the practitioner. Okay, now we come to the meditation of the day, which is the self-interrogation, by the way. You can scan it here. And if you want to make sure that you are on the right path, you should ask yourself a few questions into your mind. And again, when it comes to self-interrogation, it is very important that you do not jump to an answer. You want to let the questions endure in your mind and not immediately answer them, because an immediate answer is pretty much always rooted in craving. You just want the questions to be there so that you endure whatever feelings come from that question or from the question being there in the mind. And you want to do it over and over until you are very, very sure that you are on the right path. And you have to do that by yourself. No other person can do that. No other person can know your inner workings. So it has to be self-honesty and responsibility that get you there. So you can do that if you wish. It's a very fruitful practice to really question yourself if you are really as far in the practice as you think. It's very important because nothing is more harmful than thinking that you are done too early. Okay, and now, as always, we have some questions that you could ask, because again, there will be certain perplexing points in the way I presented things, because a lot of that goes against the mainstream of Buddhism, goes against the mainstream of Mahayana, Vajrayana, and Theravada. Because in my opinion, all those traditions have introduced wrong elements and wrong interpretations when it comes to the suttas. So you should really make sure to ask questions if there's anything perplexing. And again, please do so in a new comment, so YouTube will inform me. Otherwise, it might be that your question goes unnoticed, as I cannot scroll through all the videos every day. And it's far easier for me to see them like that. So if you have any questions by any means, please ask them down below so that other people can benefit from them in 1 or 2 or 3 Q&A videos at the end of the lecture. And now we have the typical contact slide. If you want to support me on Patreon, feel free to do so. If you want to join the Dhamma Hub Discord and find some like-minded practitioners, also feel free to do so. And if you want to look through books that I've written on Amazon, also feel free to do so. But yeah, I think this is pretty much it for today. If you enjoy what I do here and think that other friends of you could benefit from such a lecture, feel free to share it with them to get some good Dhamma among the people. So if you want to, feel free to do that. But yeah, apart from that, I don't think there is any more to say for today. So thank you very much for watching, and maybe until next time, where we will talk about formal methods. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.